Thank you very much, Hannah, and thank you for the awesome work that you do with IEN and for hosting this webinar with us today. As Hannah said, my name is Jake Schwartz. Thank you, everybody who is joining us. Today we're going to be talking about the intersection of biodiversity, of investing, and of animal welfare. I'm an analyst at Blue Capital, where we focus on including biodiversity in our investment research. Joining me here today in the studio, we have Vicki Benjamin, the co-founder and president of Blue Capital, as well as Thomas Yoon, who is the head of research at Blue Capital. We also have joining us from London, Maria Latini, who's the executive director of the FAIR Initiative. The FAIR Initiative is an organization that focuses on the ESG issues surrounding animal agriculture. And we also have Fozzie Adam, who also works at FAIR. So thank you both for joining us remotely. And now I'm going to ask all of the panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Vicki.
Good afternoon or good morning, depending on your geographic location. My name is Vicki Benjamin. I'm the co-founder and president of Blue Capital, an SEC-registered investment advisor that focuses on influencing the capital markets to move forward biodiversity, animal welfare, and environmental stewardship. Thank you.
Thomas?
Good morning and good afternoon. I'm Thomas Yoon. I head research at Blue Capital. Really excited to be here. I'll be discussing a little bit of our research process and how we integrate biodiversity when we construct our portfolio.
Thanks, Thomas. Maria?
Great. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Very excited to be here. My name is Maria Latini. I'm an executive director of the FAIR Initiative. We are an institutional investor network, so we have over 250 investors whose combined assets total $28 trillion. And again, we focus just on the risks and opportunities associated with how we're producing animals for food and the opportunities that plant-based meat alternatives afford the sector in order to really think about how we're going to be feeding a growing population into 2050.
Thanks, Maria. And Fozzie, whose title is Research and Engagement Director, I forgot to mention earlier.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to IEN and to the Blue Capital team for inviting us to participate in this webinar today. At FAIR, I'm part of the Research and Engagements team, and I lead a number of projects looking at the issues of climate change, deforestation, and biodiversity loss in livestock production, as well as a work stream looking at sustainable aquaculture.
Thank you, Fozzie. So we're going to jump right into some questions with our panelists, and thank you to all of our panelists for being here today. So let me start and direct the first question to you, Vicki, and it's a two-part question. First, what made you decide to center an investment firm around biodiversity preservation? And the second part of the question is, how do you integrate ESG in a broader sense into your investment process?
Great question. About 4.5 years ago, when my partner and co-founder of Blue Capital and I thought about launching an investment product, we looked around at the investing landscape and noticed that in the socially responsible space, there were fossil fuel-free products, there were fair trade products, and gender-related products. But nothing really was centered around nature. And so when we looked at that, we thought there's a bit of a shortfall here. And we knew that nature is fundamental to the sustainability of life. Approximately 50% of global GDP, over $44 trillion, is dependent on the sustainability of biodiversity. What is biodiversity? It is virtually all the animals and plant life and the ecosystems that support them. It's important to human beings and society as a whole because it provides our food, our shelter, our water, our clothing, our biofuels, and even our health care. 70% of pharmaceuticals are based, even new ones, are based in nature. And 4 billion people, nearly half the population, rely on nature-based solutions. What's amazing about biodiversity is it is self-sustaining. It protects the soil and the water. It breaks down pollution. It contributes and ameliorates and betters climate change through carbon sequestration. And most importantly, it replicates itself, right? Through pollination and animals reproducing. What is scary to us, though, is that human activity and population growth is causing a shortfall in this important resource. The UN estimates between 700 billion and 1 trillion of US dollars there is a shortfall annually of replacing and replenishing the biodiversity that our society is so dependent on. Evidence: 25% of all species of plant and animal life are currently endangered. And 1 million out of 10 million species that have been cataloged are at risk of extinction. We need to slow down this trajectory for the health and sustainability of society. And although this is a challenge, it's an opportunity. And it specifically is an opportunity for investors. No stakeholders are more impactful than corporations on their dependencies and impacts on biodiversity. Investors have the ability, and even perhaps, some may argue, the responsibility to influence corporations through their investments and their advocacy strategies to encourage the development of alternatives to biodiversity-dependent products and to encourage the development of products that have less impacts. All of these opportunities and development of alternatives will offer the opportunity for financial outperformance for investors. And that's what Corner Blue Capital is about. We identify leaders in this innovation, companies that are trying to reduce their impacts or develop alternatives for society to be less intensive on biodiversity.
Thanks, Vicki. Thanks for that overview of kind of our focus on biodiversity in the investment space. So obviously there's a broad set of ESG considerations. So the second part of the question is, how do we integrate that broader sense of ESG into our research process?
Corner Blue Capital is a socially responsible investment firm, and we implement multiple strategies of ESG, multiple ways into our portfolio. First, we start out with a global universe and negatively screen out all companies that have what are determined to be socially destructive products or practices, and that would include the normal guns, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and for us, fur. We don't believe society needs fur. We can stay warm through other textiles and other alternatives. Secondarily, we have a thematic approach. As I said, we are focused on biodiversity. And much as 50% of global GDP is dependent on biodiversity, about 50% of the industries in our benchmark, which is the Morningstar Developed Market Index, are also dependent and impactful on biodiversity. So we only look at those 50% of companies, 16 specific high-impact industries. We then, further integration, for further transparency and granularity, we evaluate all those companies in those 16 industries that have environmental, social, and governance. We evaluate them on their overall behavior on corporate sustainability. Only those companies that exceed or meet or exceed the industry average are moved forward down the spectrum for Carner Blue analysts to evaluate on their biodiversity progress and performance. And so, depending on the materiality of the indicator, as Thomas will get into, we evaluate and benchmark these companies on their performance on those indicators, along with their development of innovative solutions to lead us forward to a better, more sustainable future. And finally, after we have benchmarked these companies, those companies that exceed their peers on biodiversity measurement are then evaluated for fundamental financial analysis, where there's a top-down ESG approach to integrate into our review, looking forward into the future of those companies. What does their growth trajectory look like in a post-climate change environment, and one that is hopefully less dependent on biodiversity?
Thanks, Vicki. And yeah, we are excited to get into some of the details of what that research process looks like with you, Thomas, in a little bit. But for now, let's throw it back to you, Maria. Can you tell us a little bit about how FAIR's work impacts biodiversity, and also, if you would, how it relates to Carner Blue's work and the impact management sphere? I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
It's okay. Well, I think, Vicki outlined, very, very well why biodiversity and biodiversity loss is critically important to preserving not only nature, but human existence as we know it. They really have been at the forefront of the thinking of how to integrate ESG across their portfolio, and why it's important to think about animal production and consumption specifically in broader ESG outcomes. So, I mean, as I mentioned, FAIR looks at the risks associated with intensive animal production and into the food system and opportunities for plant-based protein. But I mean, these factory farms are of a massive scale, right? And you can only imagine, when you think about it, at any given moment, there's 70 billion chickens on the planet that we're actually producing into the food system. So it's not unusual to think, wow, this industry must have pretty significant impacts on the environment and now we know human health, as well as using those critical natural resources, right? So we look at, across the spectrum, climate-related impacts, GHG emissions, water, antibiotic use, food safety. And when you think about the amount of water these farms use, the amount of waste these farms produce, the amount of antibiotic residues that come from these farms, and the forests that in many cases these farms will eventually destroy, it's really clear that preserving biodiversity and thinking about biodiversity preservation also through an intensive animal agriculture lens is really important. And so we see it as our role at FAIR's to fill this knowledge gap for institutional investors, right? We have a product that we call the Color Fair Protein Producer Index. And really it's an assessment or a benchmark of the largest global protein suppliers in the market. So these are the meat, fish, and dairy suppliers to all of the consumer-facing brands that we know today, whether it be fast food companies or global food manufacturers like Nestle and Unilever, or restaurant chains, right? And so it's really critical that we understand how this industry is really affecting our outlook on global biodiversity. And within that framework, I can say across, just sort of as an overall view, we do this assessment every year. This year, we've just gone through our third year of the assessment, and we're just starting on the fourth year. But still, I mean, I'd say 40, 50 years on since factory farms or intensive animal agriculture really is ramped up, we still see through our index that 63% of the companies assessed overall across all ESG risk factors still fall within the high risk category, right? And I think it's become crystal clear now that as a result of COVID, that there's still a lot of work to do with respect to how we use our natural capital and how we're managing the social and human health issues with respect to how we're producing food. So as you, Fozzie introduced herself and you also introduced her, but Fozzie looks specifically at biodiversity loss and deforestation. And it has been really hugely affected by how we're producing food. So I don't know, this is probably a good time for perhaps you to jump in, Fozzie, and talk a little bit about how we're specifically looking at those particular risk factors within a broader framework.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Maria. So as Maria mentioned, FAIR publishes the Protein Producer Index, which assesses a lot of these animal protein companies across 10 material ESG issues. And biodiversity loss and deforestation is one of those 10 factors that we assess companies on. It's extremely material to livestock production, as animal agriculture uses 83% of the world's farmland. So any investor that's seeking to manage risks associated with land use change and biodiversity loss must be looking at companies in their portfolio that are part of the livestock supply chain. Historically, we haven't seen much movement from companies on this issue. It's consistently been one of the worst performing risk factors for livestock companies. In 2020, the Protein Producer Index assessment found that of the 50 meat and poultry companies that we evaluate, 82% of those rank as high risk for their performance on biodiversity and deforestation. However, some of the companies that are most exposed to this risk, such as big Brazilian beef producers, have recently announced new initiatives to combat deforestation. JBS, for example, which is the world's largest meat processing company, has just launched a new program aiming to supply full supply chain visibility over its tier 1 and tier 2 cattle suppliers in the Amazon, which will help it enhance its monitoring of deforestation amongst its suppliers. And the company will also provide technical support to farmers to help them raise cattle sustainably. One of JBS's peers, Marfrig, another Brazilian beef company, has been even more ambitious, launching a commitment to have 100% of its cattle supply chain deforestation-free by 2030. And these initiatives from leading companies are encouraging and a step in the right direction. But as animal protein production is a relatively fragmented industry, we need to see change occurring across the whole protein production spectrum. So thinking about how biodiversity issues impact fish production as well, it's clear that aquaculture producers face a different set of biodiversity issues to meat and poultry producers. And while fish farmers also use soy in their feed, the volume sourced are much lower than that for meat and poultry. So the exposure to deforestation through soy sourcing is lower. However, key high-value species in fish farming, such as salmon and shrimp, are known as carnivorous fish that require other fish in their diet. And on fish farms, this is addressed through the use of fish meal and fish oil, which are products made from wild fish. From a biodiversity perspective, the types of fish used to make fish meal and fish oil are consumed by many marine animals further up the food web. So maintaining healthy stocks of these fish is critical to maintaining healthy marine ecosystems. In an investment context, this presents several different risks. Firstly, volumes of fish meal and fish oil are forecast to remain flat, as most of the fisheries that we source these fish from are at maximum sustainable levels. They cannot be exploited anymore. So reliance on these resources presents a potential growth constraint for aquaculture companies. Secondly, and partially as a result of this flat supply, prices of fish meal and fish oil are forecast to increase dramatically, both as a result of that flat supply and the risk of climate change increasing volatility of yields. There are lots of different scenarios out there looking at this, but the figures range quite widely. They estimate price increases of fish meal and fish oil of between 14 and 120% up to 2050. And considering that feed makes up around 30 to 50% of fish farmers' production costs, this is a material pricing issue. Luckily, there's lots of innovation happening in the sector, and lots of startups and new ventures are looking into potential alternatives to solve this issue. Alternatives to fish meal and fish oil, such as algae-based products, insect-based ingredients. But at the moment, we're not seeing these being widely incorporated into salmon farmers' feed formulations. So as a result, FAIR has just launched a new collaborative engagement. We'll be speaking to 8 key aquaculture companies, encouraging them to disclose strategies to manage risk associated with soy, fish meal, and fish oil use, and increase uptake of alternative ingredients, both to secure their future growth and also to protect global biodiversity.
Thank you, Fozzie, and thank you, Maria. I definitely recommend to anybody watching this webinar to check out the Protein Producers Index. I've looked over it, and it's got some really valuable information that you should check out if you're making any sort of investments. So, sticking with this ESG framework, which is, of course, the most well-known way that we think about sustainable investing. I'm going to kind of go through the E, S, and G and talk to Thomas and talk to Fozzie about, and Maria about the ways that they look at each of those sections of environmental, social, and governance. So starting with you, Fozzie, and your work with animal agriculture, you just discussed deforestation, but what are some other environmental risks that you look at when it comes to intensive animal agriculture?
I think one of the big risks is climate change, which obviously is very closely linked to deforestation. But it's definitely kind of the overarching big environmental risk that this sector is facing. Globally, 14.5% of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions are due to animal agriculture, which is a huge proportion compared to other sectors. It's slightly higher than the global transport sector. The good news is there's huge mitigative potential in the sector. An FAO analysis suggests that if the 10% most high impact producers adopted practices of the 10% lowest impact producers, emissions from livestock production could be reduced by as much as 30%. But the literature surrounding sustainable food systems is very clear. We need to adopt more sustainable practices in meat production and shift to more plant-based diets if we're to produce enough protein for the world's growing population. And our work does that in a number of ways. We look both at kind of solutions on the supply side to incentivize companies to perform better on climate change issues, and also capturing some of the opportunities with a shift towards plant-based proteins. So our Protein Producer Index, which benchmarks companies on these issues, is incentivizing a race to the top, assessing companies on various aspects of their GHG performance, the quality of their disclosures of their emissions, whether their absolute emissions are going up or down, and how they're managing the kind of emerging threat of climate risk. And to supplement that, FAIR has also published a climate risk tool, which shows how companies that are covered by the index are exposed to climate risk and analyzes the potential upside or downside of these companies in a 2-degree warming scenario. The potential profitability of these companies, depending on whether they take a progressive or regressive pathway, is calculated based on the climate impacts that the company faces and its ability to mitigate those risks. And looking more on the kind of consumption solutions, FAIR is engaging companies to take advantage of the shift towards plant proteins. We run a collaborative engagement targeting 25 of the world's biggest food manufacturers and retailers, encouraging them to adopt a strategy to incorporate more plant-based proteins and alternative proteins as part of their strategy to shift towards sustainable food production in a 2-degree world. And we've seen some great successes with that engagement. Just last year, Tesco, which is a leading UK retailer, announced a goal to increase sales of plant-based proteins by 300% by 2025. And Unilever, the global food manufacturer, FMCG company, quickly followed suit, announcing aims for €1 billion of sales from plant-based products by 2027.
Thanks. That's inspiring news regarding Tesco, and it's so important to highlight the direct relationship between climate change and plant-based proteins. So thank you for your work on that. So Thomas, I know at Carner Blue Capital we do look at plant-based proteins. We of course include climate change in our models, but can you tell us a little bit more about what the environmental indicators are that we're looking at within the food and agriculture industry?
Yeah, sure. So plant-based proteins are definitely a necessary part of a sustainable future, of a future where biodiversity is preserved and the loss is reversed. I just want to say that Fozzie and FAIR's research has been a big part of our research process and learning more about the plant-based proteins. And just touching on what Vicky said earlier about the overarching theme of our process is that we are looking for solutions. Our whole research process is really about identifying the risks and finding the solutions to those risks and hopefully generating value from those solutions in the future. Before I begin and answer your question directly, I want to mention that the Carner Blues food and agriculture industry also includes not just animal ag, but commodities such as palm oil, soy, and other crops. So our universe is broader and a bit more inclusive, and our analysts here at Carner Blue researching food and ag have expertise and have a scientific background in them. So to answer your question now, the key material environmental risks that we've identified in food and ag industry are deforestation, soil degradation, water and ground pollution, and climate change, mainly from methane emissions. And of these risks are captured in our model through KPIs, key performance indicators, and we look at each key performance indicator and give them a score, and we are able to identify the leaders and laggards of the industry. So for example, a big risk, as discussed with the animal ag discussion by FAIR, is land use, deforestation. So animal agriculture has a very disproportionate land use compared to what they actually yield in terms of caloric production. They also have intensive waste pollution, as well as methane emissions that I mentioned. So we have an indicator within our model that speaks to a company's market penetration or market share of plant-based proteins or alternative proteins. And as you know, nowadays, it's pretty commonly known that Beyond Meat is a top leader in plant-based alternative proteins. So we see that as an opportunity, and we are currently invested in them, and we really see them as part of our future.
Yeah, so that's interesting. You mentioned the models with the key performance indicators, and I know that those models include weightings based on the key performance indicators. So I was hoping you could maybe tell us a little bit about how those weightings are determined.
Sure. So this is really a materiality assessment, and this began with a lot of research and expertise that our analysts have on these issues. But there are two issues that we really focus on in the food and ag industry because we really think these two issues have the most biodiversity impact. And those issues are beef production and palm oil production. So beef production, Fozzie mentioned that 83% of agricultural land is used for animals and meat production. Of that, 60% of all agricultural land is used for beef. So you can see how massive beef production is on land use. And as a result, we've really deconstructed what it means to have a sustainable beef production, if at all. So in deconstructing the beef production and the supply chain issues associated with it, we defined KPIs, and those KPIs weights were driven by a materiality assessment that we conducted based on some UN principles that we derived. And I want to mention these 5 principles from the UN. The 5 key drivers of biodiversity are land use and sea change, species overexploitation, pollution, climate change, and invasive species. So these 5 UN pillars of biodiversity loss really drive our thinking and help us frame what are the material issues. And And I want to talk a little bit about palm oil. I thought this fact was really interesting. So palm oil can only be grown between 5 to 10 latitudes of the equator, meaning they're grown in tropical forests. And most processed foods that you consume have palm oil in them, even household and personal products, even lipstick. So as a result, 80% of the palm oil production comes from Malaysia and Indonesia. And Malaysia and Indonesia are known to be the two most super mega biodiversity rich areas in the world. And considering how palm oil is so prevalent in all our everyday life with products, its impact is really massive on deforestation. So we really look at that and we deconstruct palm oil similarly as we have done with beef production.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to stick with you actually for a minute. Thank you for talking about those environmental issues. We've kind of talked about the environmental issues all of us have surrounding this, but there are also social issues that pertain to the food and agriculture industry, and I think maybe those are less commonly known. And so I was hoping you can talk about what social issues is Carner Blue looking at when we analyze companies within that industry.
Sure, that's a great question. Just before I begin answering your question, I want to make sure that our social risks are really colored by our main strategic goal, which is to identify biodiversity risks and to essentially convert them into opportunities. So the three primary social risks that we've identified under the biodiversity scope are human health, consumer preferences, and social licensure. So human health really, there are two risks to it. First is viral, and the second is bacterial. I forgot to mention, these two are under the branch of zoonotic diseases, which are diseases that come from animals. And as we know, right now we're dealing with the coronavirus, and that might have stemmed from animal contact, wildlife contact. So I spoke of viral infections. Viral infections really come from wildlife contact. And whenever we deforest through food and through agricultural practices that are not sustainable, we really heighten our risk for another zoonotic disease or a pandemic risk. Some of the risks in the past have been swine flu and bird flu as well, and some suspect even HIV. I mean, HIV definitely did come from the wildlife, but does it come from food and ag? It's debatable. But the second issue is the bacterial infections, and Fozzie touched on this as well as Maria. The prophylactic use of antibiotics within confined spaces of factory farming can really enhance the risk of a superbug, which is essentially a bacterial infection that's resistant to antibiotics, and that'll be very hard to deal with. So those are the risks that we've identified, and some of the opportunities to address those risks are food and agriculture companies that supply from not factory farms, but from local producers that have more space between the workers. Because one of the big issues during this pandemic was that big factory farms, it was impossible under the current their working conditions to maintain 6 feet distance. There was definitely some strikes. And the resiliency of that business really, really took a hit. So we recognize that there will be a future pandemic, although hopefully it'll be better contained. But if it does happen, we want to be invested in companies that rely on a more resilient supplier, such as local and more decentralized supply chain than factory farms. And hopefully that's the future that we will have. But that's essentially lowering our volatility and the risk of these companies if you do invest in them. So I think really FAIR has been a leader in identifying these zoonotic risks and identifying opportunities within the space. And we really incorporate their research into our process as well. So I'll briefly touch on the other two social risks. One is consumer preferences. The society's really, consumers are moving towards giving up some of their personal preferences or paying a premium to purchase better products, meaning more sustainable products or more ethical products. And that really has been a trend. Thirdly, social licensure, social risk is really about consumer preferences as well, in a sense, because social licensure really causes reputational damage for a company. Social licensure lies in, mainly in the food and ag industry, it lies in the indigenous communities who inhabit about 25% of the biodiversity-rich areas in the world. So as a result, the slashing and burning practice, which is pretty common with unsustainable food and agriculture companies, really encroach on indigenous communities' lands. And with information being so quickly spread nowadays with the internet and technology, it really is a big risk now, and we've identified as a material risk. And one of the solutions that we look at are better farming practices, such as regenerative agriculture. We have a company called General Mills that we really think is a leader in that field.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for going over those social risks, and I do think that it's so important to talk about it would be hard to overstate the importance of consumer preferences and what products they're looking for. It's driving, I think, a sea change in all sorts of consumer products, particularly in plant-based protein. So that's really important. Mm-hmm. Maria, I'd like to ask you a similar question about social issues, but pertaining to intensive animal agriculture. What are some social issues that you're looking for at FAIR in that area?
Well, I mean, for one, I think we can't overlook at working conditions. And, Thomas mentioned we saw the meat supply chain pretty much, crumble to the ground through COVID, right? And I think before this COVID crisis, we probably never had the public really visualizing how we produce and process animals, right? And we wouldn't have expected them to. But I think that visual reality was really put in front of our face with the breakdown of the processing supply chain, right? So understandably, we didn't understand how perhaps meat was processed and in what conditions the workers were in when they were processing this meat. And we really weren't taking care of this industry because we didn't understand how these workers actually were integrated into their broader communities. And by not taking care of the workers in this industry, what the knock-on effect would be to the general community, right? We saw really high rates of COVID infection in those communities. And in many cases, those communities were very dependent on those large processing plants. And so obviously this has been a critical issue, and working conditions in the agricultural supply chain were always part of our assessment of how protein producers were managing risk. However, we thought it was extremely important to sort of re-highlight this risk from a global perspective. And so, again, maybe a shameless plug for FAIR, but coincidentally this week we have launched another collaborative investor engagement, which is open to investors, specifically with the global meat producers and processors, again, addressing these issues around working conditions, which we know now are suboptimal. And, another issue I'd like to raise and sort of build off of what Thomas said is, the antibiotic overuse in the animal agriculture supply chain is pretty important to touch on here. And while we've known that the use of antibiotics in the livestock supply chain is definitely propagating bacterial resistance to antibiotics. And just to clarify for sort of our audience, it's, even if you are buying organic meat, or even if you're a vegan, you will still suffer the impacts of us using antibiotics in the meat supply chain. So this was still an issue that was brought up in COVID, right? It was extremely interesting, and you saw the medical community actually really struggling to treat the secondary bacterial infections associated with COVID patients because they actually had the real-time evidence that there's a definite increase in antimicrobial resistance among patients. And again, this resistance cultivates in your gut. It's transmitted just similar to what we've seen with COVID virus, right? Through the air, through tactile connections. And it's not necessarily about, eating meat, which has been treated with antibiotics and the antibiotic revenue still remaining on that meat. So this is really the next epidemic that is just simmering and waiting to happen, but one that we know is on our doorstep. So this is one of those risks that we need to be acting on now, and we can see it coming because we see it every day, and we've seen it through COVID. And I think, you're right. We're probably right to mention some of the social issues that we need to be thinking about around plant-based proteins, right? So the good part about plant-based alternative proteins is that we know now that they use less, that less water, produce less greenhouse gas emissions, and in most cases use no antibiotics. But I will say that we need to take learnings, right, from the animal ag sector. And once we see the consumers moving more towards healthier products, perhaps more plant-based protein products, we'll see a scaling up of some of these underlying proteins as well, whether it be soy or pea protein, et cetera. And we need to make sure that we're looking at these commodities as well, and thinking about the social issues associated with cultivating those products, as well as taking into account transitioning farmers who have typically been growing animals into the food system and helping and incentivizing them to move towards more plant-based alternatives, right? And so I would highlight that we're mindful of the need to make sure we're ensuring an equitable transition as we move away from those high-emitting animal-based products to more plant-based meat alternatives.
Thanks, Maria. Those human health and human rights issues are so important, and thank you for highlighting them. I'm going to bring this next question to Fawzi. We have about 15 minutes left, and we'd like to leave some time for questions. So I would like, for the next two questions, you and Fawzi, Thomas, you and Fawzi, if you could give us a short overview of what are the governmental issues, the third prong, probably the least loved prong of the ESG trifecta. So what governmental issues, Fawzi, do you see when you're looking at intensive animal agriculture?
Oh yeah, so there's two ways that we can answer this. I think in terms of ESG and a more traditional governance approach, we do assess governance in the Protein Producer Index. It's one of the 10 key material issues we look at, but we reframe it slightly away from traditional corporate governance issues and look specifically at governance of sustainability throughout the organization. And some of the key things we look for include whether the company's board has oversight of ESG issues, whether board members have relevant sustainability expertise, and also how the company is prioritizing innovation on sustainability solutions, and how company executives are incentivized to improve climate change performance, among other things. But thinking broadly about government and policy, it's also very apparent that we do need changes in the national and international policy spheres to incentivize companies to move towards more sustainable production. So to give a couple of examples of those, livestock production is very dependent on government subsidies. In OECD countries, these subsidies amounted to $53 billion in 2013. And to give you a better sense of what that means, in the EU, cattle subsidies are roughly equivalent to $190 per cow. And in China, pork subsidies are roughly equivalent to $47 per pig. And on the flip side, we're not seeing very much explicit government support for plant protein innovation. The one clear example that we have is the Canadian government, which has identified plant protein innovation as one of its 5 key innovation superclusters, supporting the Canadian economy to kind of stay on top of its game in terms of technological innovation. And also on the policy side, we are seeing some more moves, interestingly, not necessarily to openly support plant-based diets, but to integrate environmental externalities into food pricing. The EU Farm to Fork strategy contains recommendations on this, and the UK government's Dasgupta review, the final report was released yesterday, which some of you may be aware of, and strongly recommends that governments integrate the cost of natural capital into national accounting systems, pricing systems, and that businesses and financial institutions measure and disclose their dependencies and impacts on nature so that we can fully account for the costs of biodiversity loss, and then hopefully incentivize companies and investors to integrate those into strategy and decision making.
Thanks. Thank you, Fozzie. So the same question to you, Thomas. Within the food and agriculture industry at Karner Blue, what governmental risks are you looking for at a high level?
Sure. So when we think about governance issues generally, we think about CEO compensation, labor rights, etc. But we really look at it from a biodiversity lens. And in doing so, the governance risks are really, if you think about it, are driven by the environmental and social risks. Because without the environmental and social risks, the governance really, don't have an incentive to do anything, right? So just addressing that and what Fozzie has said about natural capital being recognized as something that should be included in a financial statement for the bottom line, is that there might be a fiduciary obligation in the future for the C-levels and the directors to really consider natural capital as part of their financials, to ensure that they really are looking at the picture whole in a right way, in a comprehensive way for their investors. So in relation to that, I think there's a litigation risk, potential litigation risk. Right now, shareholders are limited to shareholder resolutions in terms of expressing their sustainability qualms. But I think there could be an opening for litigation in the future. And another one is meat tax. I think there might be a meat tax in the future. So agriculture companies that have a big meat segment may experience larger costs of operation and raw materials, as Fozzie mentioned. The second issue that I want to talk about is really related to the new Biden administration. Biden has promised that PFAS, or colloquially known as forever chemicals, will be classified as a hazardous substance in the next 2 years. And PFAS are found everywhere in the food and ag industry. They range from the microwave popcorn bags to the French fry holders to the papers that wrap hamburgers. So it really is a distinct risk that's right on the horizon. The third risk that we've identified is governmental subsidies. So we think the subsidies currently being supporting agricultural crops for animal feedstocks such as soy and corn will be shifted towards products of more sustainable future and farmers that practice regenerative agriculture. There's an example in Maryland where a farmer he uses cover cropping during off seasons for his cash crops. He's getting paid for the carbon he's injecting into the soil, and it's a great way for farmers to make extra income and also to do their part in saving the environment.
Yeah, that type of alignment of economic interests and environmental interests is really at the heart of what we do, at the heart of impact investing. It's so important.
Yes.
Okay, so we have just a few minutes left. So we have a few questions here. I'm going to pick one of them. I think that this probably could apply to Fair or Karner Blue Capital. So I'm going to put it out for anybody and whoever would like to answer, feel free. So here we go. From Emmanuel Chastanet. How do you consider intensive farming practices apart from food, including companies producing fertilizers and pesticides, as these products and the whole intensive farming practice is known to be very detrimental to soil quality and soil biodiversity?
So, Fozzie, do you want to start with that, or should we?
So,
I don't mind if you want to start us off, I can follow up.
So we are looking at Carner Blue, we have chemicals as one of our 16 key industries, and we are also looking at the effect of chemicals on pollinators in agriculture. So in the chemical industry, we are evaluating those companies that are producing fertilizers with very harmful toxic substances. And then in the agriculture industry, we're looking at how the fertilizers are used and the impact they have on pollinators. So a lot of folks don't realize that pollination is responsible for about 40% of crops that are produced. And out of that 40% of crops, 50% of those crops are pollinated by bees. So we are facing a 40% decline since the 70s on our insect population. So we are fully expecting, much as Thomas mentioned, some kind of changes coming around from governance regarding the use of these highly toxic chemicals in fertilizers.
Yeah, so I just want to add to that. So an opportunity that we see is in UVB alternatives to pesticides. So Panasonic is a company that we look at, and they've developed UVB light to prevent pests on strawberries. And we really think that's an innovative way to reduce pesticide use. Alternatively, we also look at natural pesticides such as tea tree oil, and there's one called a neem oil that's naturally derived, that's used as a pesticide. So currently, if there's a company, a chemical company that has strong exposure to a pesticide that we deem to be dangerous for the environment, even though the EPA might not say so, we filter them out and do not consider them an investable company.
thanks. Yeah.
Additionally, we've found some innovation with companies like John Deere that are actually able to use like facial recognition technology on plants such that those plants are not sprayed with fertilizers and are kept safe from harm. So no longer collateral damage.
Yeah, and that's really cool.
It's very cool.
Mm-hmm.
Maria or Fozzie, is there anything that you would like to add to that question? And I can repeat the question if you'd like.
No, it's fine. I think there's definitely some context we can add around there. I mean, it's really exciting to hear about all of these potential solutions to this issue. I think some of the insights from the Protein Producer Index can help give a little bit of background on why these solutions are so urgently needed. Waste and pollution is one of the 10 factors we assess as part of the Protein Producer Index. And company performance on this risk factor as well is fairly poor. So all of the meat and poultry companies, which total 50 companies, are assessed on this, and the average score on this KPI, on this risk factor, is just 10%. Out of the 50 companies, 49 of those rank as high risk on this issue. So as part of our methodology, we look into whether companies have a nutrient management plan, including responsible use of fertilizers and pesticides in crop production. But only 10% of those 50 companies, so 5 companies, have a sustainable agriculture policy in place that addresses nutrient management in feed farming. So there's really an urgent need for companies to adopt some of these innovative solutions that aim to meet some of these challenges.
Yeah, that is important context. That 10% is an interesting number. And earlier, I think, I don't want to try to get the exact number, but you talked about how a high percentage in the 60s of the companies that you're looking at are what you'd call high ESG risk. And I think that that's what's driving why this is such an important question. So it is nearly 11 o'clock Eastern time anyway, and so I think that we will end it there. Thank you very much to everybody who has joined us. We are going to provide a video of this entire event afterwards, and we're going to have a slide up right when this closes, which will have contact information for Carnegie Blue Capital and the FAIR Initiative. So on behalf of Intentional Endowments Network, the FAIR Initiative, and Carnegie Blue Capital, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.